The extremely discreditable feature of your performance was missing the infantry, for in that failure is demonstrated beyond refutation your slovenly, happy-go-lucky, harum-scarum style of work for which you have always been distinguished at your different schools.
Welcome to Creating Churchill, an alternative biography of soldier, journalist, war leader and greatest Briton, Winston Churchill. His story has been told so many times, his bulldog image has become so familiar, that today Churchill can seem more meme than man. So this podcast series aims to get closer to the real Churchill, seeing him once again as his contemporaries saw him, the people he collaborated or clashed with. I'm Russell Barnes and I'm talking with historian David Reynolds, exploring how Churchill's life and character were shaped by relationships with friends, rivals, enemies and family. In this opening episode, perhaps Churchill's most formative and unhappiest relationship, his relationship with his father. My first question to David was just who was Winston's father, Lord Randolph Churchill?
Well, Lord Randolph was born in 1849, the third son of the Duke of Marlborough. So that means he can't inherit the title, but he's part of one of the leading aristocratic families in the country, whose home is Blenheim, the palace that was built for John Churchill, the first Duke of Marlborough, after he'd won those amazing victories over the armies of Louis XIV of France in the early 1700s. So we're talking about a really illustrious family tree. And Randolph himself has a meteoric rise as a Tory Member of Parliament. In 1886, he was made Chancellor of the Exchequer by the Prime Minister Lord Salisbury when he's only in his mid-30s. But Randolph lasts a mere 5 months as Chancellor. His career just crashes and burns because he's willful, he's impulsive, he's deeply ambitious, but he's a man of very erratic moods. He decided to take on the Prime Minister over the budget, over what was going into what Randolph considered his budget. The Prime Minister calls his bluff, he forces Randolph out, and that's the end of Lord Randolph's political career. After that, he almost wastes away. And eventually he dies in 1895, so less than a decade later. And some people said the basic cause of his death was syphilis. So it's all deeply embarrassing and really tragic. And he dies, and this is really ironic, just as his son, Winston, was graduating from Sandhurst Military Academy. Now, he and Winston had never been close. Lord Randolph always seemed to be ticking him off as a lazy good-for-nothing. But at that point, with Lord Randolph's death, the chance of any positive relationship was cut short forever. And Winston always felt that. He felt it deeply. I think it's almost mortifying. Violet Asquith, who was a lifelong friend of Winston's, said that throughout his life, he worshipped at the altar of his unknown father. I think those words are really quite striking. Worship, the sense of reverence, and also that feeling that he was worshipping an unknown God, someone he never ever really got to understand or know. And we'll see that Winston really went on in many ways to create a father, create his own image of Lord Randolph, because he'd never really known the human being who had been his father.
This is a relationship then that haunts Churchill all the way through his life. And pretty literally at one point, when we filmed together Churchill's Forgotten Years, about the last 20 years of Churchill's life at Chartwell, we filmed in the artist studio there, and you told the story of the dream. It's the most extraordinary story.
Yes, I still remember it, and you do as well. And it's in a beautiful setting, the artist studio down the hill from the house at Chartwell, overlooking the Weald of Kent. So it's a perfect setting. Churchill loved to work in the artist studio, specially created for him. And the story came to light when He was dining one evening, I think in November 1947, with his son Randolph and his daughter Sarah. And Sarah said to him, kind of keep up the conversation at dinner, she said, well, Bob, who else would you like to have had at this dinner table apart from us? And she imagined that he would cite some great figure from the past, maybe Napoleon, maybe Julius Caesar, some great military leader. And to her surprise, he said, my father, of course. And then he told the story. And as he told it, it was a dark evening, a few weeks before maybe, in the studio, winter's evening, and he's working on a portrait of his father that had been done in that year, 1886. It was a badly damaged portrait, and Winston was trying to make a copy of it. And he didn't usually do portrait painting. He did landscapes, lots of landscapes. So he was focused on his own easel and paints and things like that, and thinking about colors, and constantly looking at the original painting. And then suddenly he said, I felt a presence in the room. And he looked round, and in the red armchair was his father. So Winston got over the shock, and his father said, well, it's very nice to see you, Winston. And then he said, what year are we in? So Winston said, 1947. He said, my goodness, that's a long time since I died. What a great deal must have transpired, must have happened. So Winston started to tell him some of the things that had happened in the 20th century, the wars and so on. He reassured his father that some things had not changed. The Tory party was still there, the Church of England and the Turf Club. But in terms of conflicts and battles, what he told his father about the two world wars and about the massive changes, for example, the Bolshevik Revolution and so on, this was very disconcerting. And they talked about this for a bit, and his father asked what Winston did for a living, and he said, I write, I'm a journalist. And father said, well, that's not a discreditable profession. I wrote for newspapers and so on. And then reflecting on all the horrors that Winston had talked about, his father said, it's a great pity, Winston, you didn't make something of your life. Those terrible school reports and all the rest of it. If only you could have done something useful, you could have gone into politics. You might have made a name for yourself. You might have helped to change things for the better. And so Winston was about to say, well, Papa, as it happens, and then his father struck a match to light his cigarette, and he just vanished. And so Winston told that story to Sarah and Randolph, his children, over dinner, and they said, Father, you must write this down. He wrote it down. It's in the Churchill archives in Cambridge, and it was published in 1966, a year after Winston's death, in the Telegraph. So it's an interesting question, quite what was going on there, but clearly here is a man nearing the end of his life, still preoccupied with his father.
So let's go back and look at that early relationship and how that preoccupied him. It was pretty miserable, wasn't it? Lord Randolph was a really tough father to have.
Yes, like most parents of that era, father and mother were not closely engaged with the upbringing of the children. The father certainly was there as the pater familias, if you like, the disciplinarian and so on. And he was very unsatisfied with the way that his son was going about things. And in particular, the school reports which came up in that dream, there were some bad school reports. Winston did not like exams. He did not like Latin. He did not like Greek. And did not get engaged in many of the things that mattered if you were going to make something of your life. So passing exams mattered. To move from prep school to Harrow, the school that he went to, the public school, in other words, private school, where he was educated, and then on to Sandhurst. And his father was very angry about the school reports on some of the exams. So one that stuck in Winston's mind, written in 1893, at the time when he was doing the Sandhurst exams, referred to your happy-go-lucky, harum-scarum approach to work, which has always distinguished you in all your different schools. And the failure to work for his exams, the marks that he got, and he warned that if he carried on like this, Winston would be one of the sort of public school failures that were a disgrace to the country. So this was tough stuff. Winston himself was somebody who actually, if he wasn't interested in the work, he really didn't make much of an effort. There were things that fascinated him, history, he loved poetry, he could learn verses and verses of poems by heart. That was the sort of thing he loved. He loved historical adventures, he loved stories of battles and wars and so on. But basic grammar and things like that, Greek, he saw no point to it. It was a completely stupid language, as in his view. So here is a man who basically had talent, but it didn't really come out as a young person in his adolescence. And his father really focused on those deficiencies and really gave Winston a very hard time.
I mean, what's interesting is that he's clearly a bit of a rebel in a sense, rebelling against these subjects, if you like, that are so important to the public school system at that time. He knows his own mind, and he's breeding a kind of defiance, strangely, that actually perhaps would one day be useful.
Yes, he is not afraid to answer back if he feels he's being treated badly or is being told to do things which are completely stupid. So the whole business of Latin is something that really gets up his nose. And he writes in a book he published called My Early Life about one or two of the exchanges he has with the teacher. So he takes what's called the vocative case, and he says, look, why does the Latin word mensa mean o table as well as a table? And the teacher replies, you would use the vocative, you would use it when you are addressing the table. But I never do. If you are impertinent, you will be punished, and punished most severely. That is a perfectly reasonable question. I mean, it is very bizarre to imagine that kind of schooling. And Winston talks back about it. I mean, this is clearly already a young man who makes his own agenda and is not afraid to take on the authorities. The fact that he wasn't acculturated to that whole tradition of studying classical languages and philosophy and so on, what was called at Oxford University greats, that degree, I think was a benefit for Churchill. I somehow think that if he had been pegged into a sort of disciplinary framework as a young man at school and at university, some of his versatility would have gone. Here's a man who is fascinated by writing and by history and poetry, but also really interested in technology, interested in gadgets, how they work and so on. And that technical side of him was something that certainly paid off when he was prime minister. He had a sensitivity, if you like, for science and technology, which many politicians of a more traditional background did not really have.
Yeah. Even so, I suppose the schools, particularly Harrow, would have bred in him a respect for country, crown, empire, and the Church of England to some extent.
Yes, he is. I mean, he takes on, if you like, the values of his father in terms of the essential principles of what the polity and the society should be. But there is that rebellious side, and certainly also this determination to make his own mark. And you see this really in what happens to him after his father dies. It coincides, the father's death, with Churchill's graduation from Sandhurst. And what we see over the next few years, from 1895 to 1901, is a young man who is now determined to make his own mark and to do it in a rush. Winston Churchill was very struck by the way that his father died relatively young, and he felt the same. He assumed that he would die in his 40s. And therefore, if he wanted to make a mark on the world, it had to be done quickly. And it had to be done by grabbing people's attention. So what you see is a young soldier almost racing around the hot spots of the British Empire in the late 1890s. He's on the northwest frontier of India. He's fighting in the Sudan in one of the last cavalry charges of the British Army at Omdurman. He's then caught up in the Boer War in South Africa and indeed becomes a prisoner of war at one point and escapes. And in each case, Winston is already a writer as much as a warrior. These exploits of his are written up for newspapers at the time and then turned into books that he publishes. So right from the start, you see somebody who believes that to make your mark, you need deeds and words. And the best person to write the words about your deeds is yourself. And this was Churchill's conception right through his life. And you see it at the very beginning in those early years after his father's death.
That's very astute. I mean, do you think the other thing that's going on in this amazing period from 1895 to 1901, his most oppressive critic, if you like, has gone? There's some sense the pressure is off. He can express himself in a way far more freely.
Yes, well, I think that's true. And I think that he is free to express himself. The other thing is that he says himself in the book My Early Life, which he publishes in 1930, looking back on those early years up to his marriage. But he says, my relationship with my mother changed. Jenny Jerome was an American New York beauty. Randolph and Jenny married after a whirlwind courtship. Lord Randolph was not a particularly faithful person. Jenny had her own flirtations, and indeed after his death, she married twice to men who were almost Winston's age. So it's all a very sort of strange, turbulent life. But the relationship between Winston and his mother became, in his words, much more equal, almost like brother and sister. And she was supporting him in these endeavors. She was the one who was often paying the bills to get him around the world. She was the one to whom he wrote and said, would you please send this, and this, and do it fast? And he would do that kind of thing. She was the one who was making sure that the texts of his newspaper articles or his books got to the publisher, the proofs were corrected, and so on. So here was if you like, a woman who now was herself liberated from the marriage with Lord Randolph and working in partnership with her son at a crucial stage in his rise to fame.
So he's a soldier, he's becoming a writer, certainly a self-publicist, very astute. But one of the books he also writes is about his father, a biography of his father. What was that about? Was it about laying Lord Randolph to rest, if you like, or was he turning it a little bit to the family's advantage, burnishing the family name?
Yes, I mean, I think he was doing both of those things, making his peace with his father and burnishing the family name, because there was a view in many quarters in politics that the Churchills were a group of political opportunists and so on. And Lord Randolph's marriage to an American didn't help. It was generally regarded as a marriage for money because Jenny was a wealthy heiress. So all those things are important. But if you think about it in terms of Winston's own career, by 1901, he is using his fame to get himself into Parliament. He's taken up by the Tory party as an MP, and he's moved into Parliament. He's espoused the principles of Tory democracy, which was what Randolph talked about. Never very clear what that meant. It sort of was really about the fact that, in Randolph's mind, the democracy, the demos, the people who had now been given the vote, were taking on the values of the Tory party, church and country, and so on. So taming, if you like, the dangers of radicalism. But Winston found increasingly that the Tory party of the early 1900s was not a party that was receptive to what he understood by Tory democracy. And in 1904, he crosses the House, as it were. He moves across to the Liberal side of the House. And so what he's doing when he writes the biography, which is published in 1906, in a sense is making a case for his father, but also making a case for himself, in the sense that he is supporting the values of Tory democracy, which, it has to be admitted now, many historians would say was mostly a slogan. It didn't really amount to very much. Randolph was very much an opportunist. But Winston is taking him as a man of principle. But what he's saying is that his father's flaw was that he stuck too long with the party. He was too loyal to the party, the Tory party. What he should have done was recognize that the future of those values that he espoused, the democratic values that he espoused, were now better championed by the Liberal Party. So in a way, what Winston was saying was that he, Winston, had done something that his father failed to do. It was almost, if you like, proving or showing that he had gone one better than his own father. And that, of course, is what often father-son relationships are about. There is a sense of rivalry of the younger person trying to make his own or her own space compared with the parent. And that's what Winston is doing in this literary form in writing the biography. It's also, it has to be said, it's a very substantial piece of work. It was 2 volumes at the time. It was republished. It was serialized. It was translated. It was successful. And so what you're seeing here is a lot of people who are commentators on political biographies saying this is a very substantial piece of work. So, this is a young man who's, still he's in his 30s. It's very, very impressive that he's done so much in such a short time. And that is certainly what he wants. He wants people to think of him as a real rising star.
So comparing them overall, there are fascinating shared patterns. They both have a meteoric rise. They both have a period in the wilderness, Churchill several. How would you put them side by side as political careers? What makes Winston Churchill, different?
Well, certainly the drive, certainly the hard work in ways that weren't true of his father. You can already see that in the young man of the 1890s, that incredible drive and intensity. Once he's doing things that he wants to do for reasons that suit him. But if you fast forward to the 1930s, it's interesting that the historian Robert Rhodes James in 1970 wrote a book which was quite controversial about Churchill up to 1939, in those years, and it was called Churchill, A Study in Failure.
Wow.
In other words, saying, look, if this man had died in 1939, if he'd been knocked over by a bus, wouldn't we have tended to say, well, it was a remarkable career. He really launched himself. He made significant achievements, but it all burnt out. So it's, if you like, his father's story on a longer pattern and over a longer period. And I think there's some truth in that. What makes him, in terms of the way we think of Churchill now, is those years as prime minister, which put everything else into a different perspective. But if you think about him in terms of his relationship with his father and comparisons with his father, there is that kind of similarity.
And they had some similar weaknesses there. I mean, neither of them were particularly collegiate. Both Churchills are massive egos.
Yes, they are. And they don't work well with others, usually. And Churchill is quite convinced that he has his own destiny. I mean, he says to Violet Asquith, who is the daughter of the Liberal Prime Minister before the First World War, Violet Asquith, he says, that we're all worms, but I believe I'm a glowworm. That sense of him really as bound to shine out, that I think went deep in his own mind. And indeed, when he becomes prime minister, he writes in his memoirs, the day that he became prime minister, he thought of it in terms of all his previous life had been a preparation for this hour. It was almost a providential situation. Churchill didn't have a very strong religious faith, but he certainly had a strong belief that some kind of providence was looking over him and singling him out as a glowworm, if you like.
So turning from Winston Churchill, the son, to Winston Churchill, the father, he has a son, Randolph, and that's also a very difficult relationship, but in a completely different way. He kind of overcompensates because of his own upbringing and indulges Randolph, and that comes at great cost eventually.
Yes, it's a very, very sad story. And Winston, because of the feeling that his father had been mean and lacking in encouragement, goes to the opposite extreme with Randolph. So you get this situation where young Randolph is sometimes brought into dinner parties in London or at Chartwell, where Churchill's entertaining the great and the good and the not so good of the day, the politicians. And so Randolph can pick up and get involved in political conversation. And Winston often asks Randolph, 13, 14, whatever, for his views, which is really encouraging a degree of arrogance in the young man, which was hugely unhelpful. And, I remember, I think you remember, we had the chance when we were doing that film about Churchill's forgotten years after 1945 to interview the younger Winston Churchill, the grandson of Winston Churchill. And this grandson, Winston, recalled, very interestingly, conversations with his grandfather, sometimes when they're walking around Chartwell or talking to the pigs, which Winston liked to do. But Winston was just laying out to young Winston the importance of hard work, of deliberate work every day. He said, you need, it was an interesting phrase, every evening you need to invigilate yourself, interrogate yourself, if you like. What have I done today? Have I done something significant? Have I completed a newspaper article? Have I made progress on a particular chapter of a book I'm working on? It's as important, young Winston said, recalling grandfather, it's as important as brushing your teeth every evening. That kind of self-interrogation about what have I done. And what's striking is that Randolph Churchill, son of Winston, father of young Winston, did not have that capacity for hard work. He was, on the whole, sybaritic. He enjoyed drink. He enjoyed smoking. He was a man who did not look after his health. And indeed, the drink and the smoking brought him to an early grave. He was not in the same bracket as his father. And in a way, I think he always knew that. There was a quite moving conversation that Winston had with Randolph, walking around the gardens of Chartwell, where Winston talked about his relationship with Lord Randolph and the space that Lord Randolph's death gave him in a way. And the message was very clear that there could only be one Churchill on the block at the one time, that Randolph knew that nothing he could do would eclipse what his own father was doing. And it's interesting that if we think back to that dream story, it's very hard to know what it meant, but was it a situation where Winston, the artist, had just nodded off on a winter evening? Or was this a kind of story that he gradually worked up in his own mind to say to his father, look, I have done much, much better than you ever did. But that was a clear sense in his own mind that there could only be one Churchill in the frame at any one time.
Yeah. So Randolph is in the shadow of Winston.
Yeah.
Then in 1965, Winston dies, and Randolph could have had his moment to be liberated himself. He starts the great work of writing Churchill's biography, as Churchill did for his own father. This was a moment, I suppose, where something could have happened for Randolph.
Yeah, well, he's now the only Churchill on the block. He had that sense, I think, almost the liberation that Winston himself seems to have had, in the time of his father's death, aftermath of his father's death, and doing that work of writing his father's biography, though with much less of a clear agenda than Winston himself had. But the sad thing is that Randolph is no longer up to it, gets through 2 volumes up to 1914, so the beginning of the First World War, and then drops dead. There's no sense that this is a significant moment for Randolph in the way that writing the biography was for Winston himself. And it's a very sad and very tragic end. And what was interesting talking to young Winston Churchill's grandson, when we did that film, was he said, my father, Randolph, was actually a much more talented orator than his own father, Winston. Randolph, you could just ask him, oh, speak about this subject or that subject, and he would jump up on a chair or whatever it is and narrate. He was a great impromptu speaker, whereas Winston, his father, had to work at the speeches. He needed to prepare them. He needed to condense the long texts into shorter, pithy notes and so on. And then he could deliver the one-liners for effect. But this wasn't something that was an impromptu skill. So you've got this really rather tragic sense of Randolph as a man who was in many ways a sadly wasted life because of the way that he had been almost imprisoned by the name of his father.
Yeah. I remember from that same interview being very moved when young Winston Churchill told us about watching his father at Winston Churchill's funeral in 1965, watching the cortege go up a very slight incline to St. Paul's, and he was wheezing and coughing and fighting for breath as one of the pallbearers. It was very, very striking and very sad to only outlive your father by 3 years and have this kind of record of failure. Generally, reflecting on all of these troubled relationships, it's hard to imagine Winston Churchill coming out of that relationship with his father, Randolph, unscathed. There is a lot of discussion around to what extent was Churchill depressed, to what extent was black dog, this phrase he used, real. Do you think there is something in the idea that there's a trauma early on in Churchill's life that he is working out, that part of his success and his drive is running away from that trauma and giving him a desperate desire to succeed?
Yes, well, I think the notion of a systemic black dog mostly derives from some comments in the diaries of Lord Moran, Churchill's physician in the war and after the Second World War. And it's not, I think, regarded as an accurate description of Churchill in a persistent way. There were certainly moments when he got very depressed, when he was sacked from the cabinet as First Lord of the Admiralty because of the failures of the Gallipoli campaign. He was distraught, and Clementine, his wife, said, I thought he would die of grief. But this ability to grab hold of himself is there again. And so what he does is to actually go out and fight on the Western Front. He does something with his depression, with his downtime. So this is a man who not so much, I think, runs away from his father, but moves very deliberately in a direction that gives him space and enables him to make his own name, or at least to make his own version of the Churchill name. Because, of course, this is not a young man who comes from nothing. This is a man who comes from a very notable political background, but with some dark spots on it, if you like. And what he's managing to do quite remarkably in that decade or so after his father's death and after leading Sandhurst is to really make a big impact on politics, on national life, as a soldier, as a journalist, as a biographer, as a politician. Incredible start. And you could say, yes, that part of that is the need to really push after his father's death, and also bearing in mind this conviction, which he has still for a number of years, that he is going to die young, and so an awful lot has to be done very quickly.
Yeah.
So I would say that if you're thinking of Churchill and leaders who shaped him, the relationship with his father is an extremely important one, but also a very complicated one, that living up to what his father expected or wanted is important. But in the end, and that's the fascination of that dream story, it's almost where he can finally answer back to his own father, look what I have done, and leaving it very clear whatever the school reports, that Winston, had done far more than Lord Randolph had done.
You've been listening to David Reynolds and Russell Barnes in Creating Churchill. Please rate, review and recommend our show on your favourite podcast app. Follow us at @creating_hist on X or Instagram, and send us your comments and questions by email to info@clearstory.co.uk. Creating History is produced and edited by Russell Barnes, with music by Rich Farnsworth, digital marketing by Lee Mann, and sound engineering by Andrew Chappell. Creating Churchill is a Clear Story, Creating History production.